Sometimes the strongest among us carry the deepest wounds, hidden behind smiles that fool everyone but those who truly care. In the quiet town of Cedar Ridge, one woman's silence held secrets that would tear a family apart. Evelyn Marks stepped into the courthouse that evening, her face veiled to hide bruises that told a story no one wanted to hear. For months, folks whispered about her sobs echoing from the ridge at night, but nobody dared speak against Eli Holt, the preacher's son who'd grown rich in cattle and cruel in spirit. His older brother Silas had heard enough. When he found Evelyn that night, broken and afraid, he knelt beside her chair and asked 5 simple words. "Tell me, who hurts you?" Her single tear was all the answer he needed. By morning, Eli Holt had vanished without a trace. No goodbye, no explanation, no search party sent. The town knows Silas holds the truth, but his eyes stay silent as stone. What really happened between those 2 brothers that night? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months before that fateful courthouse evening, Silas Holt rode home to Cedar Ridge with dust on his boots and worry weighing heavy in his chest. The northern pastures had been good to him, cattle fat, grass plenty, and the kind of solitude that let a man think clear thoughts under wide Montana skies. But something had been calling him back, a restlessness that started small and grew like storm clouds on the horizon. He'd been gone near 4 months, longer than usual, managing the family's expansion into the high country. The Holt Ranch had prospered under his steady hand, growing from his father's modest spread into one of the most successful operations in 3 counties. Folks respected the Holt name, and Silas wore that responsibility like his father's old coat, comfortable but heavy with expectation. The silver pocket watch in his vest had belonged to his father, Reverend Jacob Holt, a man who'd preached justice on Sundays and lived it every day between. "Do what's right, even when it costs you," the old man used to say, his fingers polishing that watch after evening prayers. "Especially when it costs you." Silas could hear his father's voice, clear as church bells whenever he touched the worn silver surface, feeling the weight of those words alongside the weight of time. Cedar Ridge spread out below him as he crested Widow's Point, the town nestled in the valley like pieces of a child's wooden blocks scattered by gentle hands. Main Street ran straight as Sunday morning, lined with the usual collection of storefronts: Henderson's General Store, Murphy's Saloon, the bank with its proud brick facade, and the white-steepled church where his father had ministered for 27 years before the Lord called him home. The Holt family house sat on the town's eastern edge, a 2-story, frame structure painted white with green shutters, surrounded by cottonwoods that his mother had planted when she first arrived as a young bride. She'd been gone these 8 years now, taken by consumption, despite Doc Henderson's best efforts. But her roses still bloomed fierce and red each spring, tended now by Evelyn. Evelyn Marks, now Evelyn Holt, his brother's wife, of 2 years. Silas had been surprised when Eli announced his engagement. Not that Evelyn wasn't worthy. She was beautiful in a quiet way, with auburn hair that caught sunlight like honey and eyes the color of autumn leaves. She carried herself with the dignity that came from good breeding, the daughter of a schoolteacher from back east who'd come west seeking opportunity and found love with a local merchant instead. But Eli had always been restless, quick to charm and quicker to lose interest. 10 years younger than Silas, he'd grown up differently. Spoiled, some said, though never where Silas could hear it. Where Silas had learned responsibility from his father's firm but loving hand, Eli had been coddled by their mother during her final years, her illness making her protective and perhaps too permissive. The boy had intelligence, and natural charisma. He could quote scripture with the passion of their father and discuss cattle prices with the shrewdness of a seasoned trader. But there was something underneath, a hunger that seemed to grow stronger the more it was fed. Silas remembered the wedding day. Evelyn, radiant in their mother's dress, altered to fit her slender frame. She'd looked happy then, truly happy, her laughter ringing through the churchyard as neighbors offered congratulations and best wishes. Eli had been attentive, charming, everything a new husband should be. If Silas had noticed how his brother's hand lingered possessively at Evelyn's waist, or how his smile didn't quite reach his eyes when others claimed too much of her attention, he dismissed it as normal, newlywed jealousy. Now, riding toward home with that persistent unease, gnawing at his peace of mind, Silas wondered if he should have paid closer attention. The town had grown in his absence. A new grain warehouse stood near the railroad depot, and he counted 3 additional houses on the south side of Main Street. Progress came slow but steady to places like Cedar Ridge, carried on the rails that connected small towns to larger dreams. The cattle business was good, better than it had been in years, and prosperity showed in fresh paint and new construction. He guided his horse through the familiar streets, nodding to Mrs. Patterson, sweeping her front porch, and tipping his hat to young Tommy Morrison, playing with a wooden hoop outside his father's barber shop. These were good people, the kind who'd help a neighbor without being asked, and mind their own business unless someone needed minding. But something felt different. Conversations seemed to stop as he passed, then resume in lower tones. Mrs. Patterson's smile was warm as always, but her eyes held a question she didn't voice. Even Tommy's wave seemed subdued, lacking the enthusiasm that usually accompanied his cheerful greetings. The Holt house came into view as he rounded the corner from Main Street, and Silas felt his chest tighten at what he saw. The flower beds his mother had loved lay neglected, weeds choking out the carefully planned arrangements. Paint peeled from the front porch railing, and one of the shutters hung at an odd angle, as if damaged and left unrepaired. This wasn't like Eli, who took pride in appearances and understood that the family's reputation rested partly on how well they maintained their property. More troubling, it wasn't like Evelyn, who'd thrown herself into caring for the house with the enthusiasm of a new bride creating her first home. Silas dismounted at the front gate, his boots crunching on gravel that needed raking. The house felt empty, despite the thin curl of smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. No voices carried from the open windows, no sign of the busy domestic life he'd expected to find. "Eli?" he called, pushing open the front door. "Evelyn?" Silence answered him, thick and uncomfortable. The front parlor showed signs of recent use, newspapers scattered on the side table, a coffee cup forgotten on the mantelpiece. But dust motes danced in the afternoon light, and the air held the stale feeling of rooms that weren't lived in, with joy. He found Evelyn in the kitchen, standing at the window with her back to him. She didn't turn at his approach, though he was certain she'd heard him enter. Her shoulders held a rigid tension that reminded him of cornered animals, ready to flee or fight. "Evelyn." His voice was gentle, the tone he'd use approaching a spooked horse. "I'm home." She turned then, and the sight hit him like a physical blow. The bright, laughing woman from the wedding had been replaced by someone who moved carefully, as if sudden motions might bring unwanted attention. Her dress was perfectly pressed, her hair neatly arranged, but something in her eyes had dimmed to a wary shadows. "Silas." Her smile was automatic, practiced. "We weren't expecting you. Finished up north earlier than planned." He kept his voice casual, though every instinct screamed that something was wrong. "Where's Eli?" "In town. Business at the bank." The words came quickly, as if rehearsed. He'll be pleased to see you. We both are, of course." But she didn't look pleased. She looked like a woman walking on glass, careful with every step. "How have you been, Evelyn?" He moved closer, noting how she shifted, almost imperceptibly, to keep the kitchen table between them. Not afraid of him, he realized, but trained to maintain distance. "You look tired." "Just the usual household concerns. Nothing that should worry you." The formal politeness stung worse than anger would have. This wasn't the warm, genuine woman who'd welcomed him as a brother, who'd insisted he stay for Sunday dinners and laughed at his stories from the trail. This was someone performing the role of a contented wife, hitting all the right notes, but missing the music entirely. "Evelyn." He said her name again, softer this time. "What's wrong?" For just a moment, her careful mask slipped. He saw fear there, and something that might have been hope quickly suppressed. Then the practiced smile returned. "Nothing's wrong, Silas. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine, and they both knew it. The question was whether she trusted him enough to admit it, and whether he was prepared for what that trust might cost them all. Outside, the afternoon shadows grew longer, and somewhere in town, his brother Eli was conducting business that couldn't wait for a homecoming. Silas touched his father's watch through his vest pocket and felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. Some things were more important than keeping peace in the family. Some silences needed breaking, no matter how much noise they made. He just hoped he wouldn't be too late to matter. The scream that shattered Tuesday evening's quiet came from the direction of the main house, thin and desperate as a wounded animal's cry. Silas dropped the harness he'd been mending in the barn and ran toward the sound, his boots pounding across the hard-packed earth of the yard. He found the kitchen door standing open, yellow lamplight spilling onto the porch steps like spilled honey. Inside, Evelyn sat crumpled against the far wall, one hand pressed to her left cheek, the other clutching a blood-stained handkerchief to her nose. Eli stood over her, his chest heaving with the kind of breathless rage that comes after violence has been spent. "She fell," Eli said without turning around, his voice steady despite the storm still raging in his posture. "Clumsy thing tripped over her own feet." Silas looked at Evelyn, at the way she held herself small against the wall, at the defensive curve of her spine. This wasn't the aftermath of a fall. This was the careful stillness of someone who'd learned that any movement might provoke another blow. "That's so." Silas kept his voice level, though his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. "Must have been quite a tumble to split her lip like that." "You questioning me, brother?" Eli finally turned, and Silas saw something in his younger brother's eyes that he didn't recognize. Something cold and calculating that had nothing to do with the charming boy he'd helped raise after their father died. "Just concerned about my sister-in-law." Silas moved deeper into the kitchen, positioning himself between Eli and Evelyn. "Maybe we should have Doc Henderson take a look." "No need." The word cracked like a whip, and Evelyn flinched at the sound. "She's fine. Aren't you, darling?" Evelyn's nod was barely perceptible, a tiny motion that spoke volumes about learned obedience. The blood-stained handkerchief in her grip was delicate white cotton, embroidered with tiny blue flowers, the kind of feminine touch their mother would have appreciated. Now it bore witness to something their mother never would have tolerated. "Evelyn." Silas crouched down beside her, moving slowly so as not to startle her further. "Let me see." She raised her eyes to his, and he felt something break inside his chest. The fear there was old, settled deep like sediment in a still pond. This wasn't the first time, maybe not even the 10th. How long had this been happening? How long had he been blind to it? "It's nothing," she whispered, but her voice shook with the effort of maintaining the lie. Just clumsy, like he said. Eli laughed, a sound devoid of humor. See? She's fine, no harm done. He straightened his vest, smoothing down the fabric with hands that showed no sign of the violence they'd just committed. Now, if you'll excuse us, my wife and I have some private matters to discuss. The threat was clear as church bells on Sunday morning. Stay, and things would get worse for Evelyn. Leave, and God only knew what would happen once they were alone again. Silas felt the weight of his father's watch pressing against his ribs, heard the old man's voice echoing across the years. Do what's right, even when it costs you. Actually, Eli, I was hoping we could talk. Silas stood slowly, his eyes never leaving his brother's face. About the North Pasture situation. Some things came up that need your attention. It was a lie, but it served its purpose. Eli's businessman instincts overcame his anger. Barely. What kind of things? Property line disputes, water rights, the kind of problems that could cost us plenty if we don't handle them right. Silas glanced meaningfully toward the parlor. Might take most of the evening to sort through. Eli's jaw worked silently for a moment, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. Fine. But this conversation waits until tomorrow. His eyes flicked to Evelyn, still huddled against the wall. My wife needs her rest. Silas helped Evelyn to her feet, feeling how she trembled like a leaf in winter wind. Her face was already swelling where Eli had struck her, the skin around her left eye darkening to the color of storm clouds. Tomorrow, she'd have bruises that no amount of powder could hide. Let me walk you upstairs, he said gently. That won't be necessary. Eli's voice cut between them. I'll see to my wife's needs. The possessive emphasis made Silas's blood run cold, but he forced himself to step back. Pushing now would only make things worse for Evelyn later. Instead, he watched helplessly as Eli took her arm, not roughly, but with the kind of careful control that was somehow more frightening than open violence. Good night, Silas, Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for your concern. The formal words were like a door closing between them, but her eyes held a different message, a desperate plea for help that she couldn't voice aloud. Then Eli was guiding her from the kitchen, his hand firm on her elbow, and Silas was left alone with the lingering scent of fear and the evidence of violence. He picked up the blood-stained handkerchief from where Evelyn had dropped it, the delicate fabric soft between his fingers. The blue flowers were barely visible now, overwhelmed by the dark stain of her suffering. This small piece of cloth told a story that demanded action, demanded justice. But what kind of justice? His brother was his blood, his family, his responsibility, the ranch they'd built together, the reputation they'd shared, the future they'd planned. All of it would crumble if the truth came out. Cedar Ridge was the kind of place where family scandal spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. And yet, upstairs in the room she shared with his brother, Evelyn was learning to live with terror as her daily companion. Every flinch, every careful word, every practiced smile was a small death of the spirit. How many more times would she fall? How many more blood-stained handkerchiefs would she hide away before someone found her broken beyond repair? Silas sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the blood-stained cloth still clutched in his hand. Outside, night was falling across Cedar Ridge, painting the world in shades of grey that matched the moral landscape he suddenly found himself navigating. Right and wrong had never seemed so tangled, so impossible to separate. His father's voice whispered again from memory. Sometimes the hardest choice is the right choice, son. That's how you know it's worth making. But what was the right choice here? Turn his back on family loyalty to protect an innocent woman? Destroy his brother to save his brother's wife? Risk everything they'd built for the sake of justice that might never come? Upstairs, floorboards creaked as two people moved through the familiar dance of a marriage built on fear. Silas closed his eyes and tried not to imagine what tomorrow's clumsiness might bring. Tried not to think about how many tomorrows Evelyn might have left if nothing changed. The blood-stained handkerchief felt heavier than his father's watch, heavier than the weight of family responsibility he'd carried all his adult life. It was evidence of a choice that could no longer be postponed, a truth that could no longer be ignored. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the kitchen window, Cedar Ridge slept on in peaceful ignorance. But for Silas Holt, sleep would not come easy anymore. The reckoning had begun, whether he was ready for it or not. Sheriff Morrison's badge caught the morning light streaming through his office window, but the tarnish around its edges spoke of years of compromise rather than service. Silas had known Pete Morrison since they were boys, fishing the creek behind the schoolhouse, back when right and wrong seemed as clear as the difference between trout and bass. "Appreciate you coming in, Silas," Morrison said, without looking up from the paperwork scattered across his desk. "Though I got to say, I'm not sure what you're expecting me to do about your family troubles." The casual dismissal stung worse than an outright refusal would have. Silas had spent a sleepless night wrestling with his conscience before deciding to try the official route first. His father had always believed in working within the law, respecting the institutions that held civilization together. But looking at Morrison's deliberately averted gaze, Silas wondered if those institutions were worth respecting anymore. "My sister-in-law is being beaten, Pete. This isn't family trouble. It's a crime." Morrison finally raised his eyes, and Silas saw something there that made his stomach clench. Not surprise, not outrage, not even concern. Just the weary resignation of a man who'd learned to look the other way when looking forward became inconvenient. "That's a serious accusation," Morrison said carefully. "You got proof, witnesses, something more than speculation and family drama." Silas pulled the blood-stained handkerchief from his pocket, placing it on the desk between them. The blue flowers were barely visible now, overwhelmed by the rusty brown stains that told their own story. "This is proof. I saw her last night, saw what he did to her." Morrison glanced at the cloth but didn't touch it. Could be anything. Women are delicate creatures. Could have cut herself cooking, fallen down the stairs, any number of things. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Besides, even if what you're suggesting is true, it's a husband's right to discipline his wife. That's the law of God and man." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He'd known Morrison was weak, more interested in keeping the peace than ensuring justice. But this was something else entirely. This was deliberate blindness, willful ignorance dressed up in the language of tradition. Since when is beating a woman unconscious considered discipline? Since the beginning of time, son. Morrison's voice took on the patronizing tone of a man explaining simple facts to a child. "Your brother's got a right to run his household as he sees fit. Eli's a respected member of this community, brings a lot of business to town. Lot of jobs depend on the Holt Ranch staying prosperous." There it was, the real reason for Morrison's reluctance. The Holt cattle operation employed half the county, directly or indirectly. The railroad depot shipped their beef to markets back east. The local businesses depended on their trade, and the bank held mortgages secured by their success. Economic prosperity had its own moral logic, and Evelyn's suffering was deemed an acceptable cost of doing business. My father didn't raise us to hide behind prosperity when justice was needed, Silas said quietly. Morrison's face hardened. Your father was a preacher, not a lawman. He could afford to be idealistic because other men had to deal with the practical realities. He stood up, moving to the window that overlooked Main Street. You see that new grain warehouse? That's Holt money. The fresh paint on Murphy's saloon? Holt money. Half the improvements in this town over the past 2 years came from your family's success. Silas followed his gaze, seeing the town with new eyes. Cedar Ridge had indeed prospered, since Eli had taken a more active role in the business. His younger brother had a gift for expansion, for seeing opportunities that others missed, but apparently he also had a talent for buying silence with economic dependence. So we're supposed to look the other way while he beats his wife because he spreads money around? We're supposed to be smart about what battles we pick, Morrison said, turning back to face him. You want my advice? Stay out of your brother's marriage. Nothing good comes from interfering between husband and wife. The sheriff moved back to his desk, picked up the blood-stained handkerchief, and handed it back to Silas. The gesture was final, dismissive, case closed before it had even been opened. What if it were your daughter, Pete? Silas asked, pocketing the cloth. What if it were Sarah getting beaten bloody every night by some man who thinks his fists give him the right? Morrison's face went pale at the mention of his 15-year-old daughter, but his voice remained steady. That's different, and you know it. How? How is it different? Because... Morrison stopped, caught between his protective instincts as a father and his practical calculations as a sheriff. Because it just is. Evelyn made her choice when she said, I do. She's got to live with the consequences. Silas stared at the man he'd once considered a friend, seeing instead a stranger who'd traded his integrity for an easier life. The badge on Morrison's chest might be tarnished, but it was nothing compared to the corruption that had settled into his soul. Then I guess we're done here, Silas said, moving toward the door. Silas. Morrison's voice stopped him at the threshold. Don't do anything stupid. Your brother's got friends in this town, important friends. People who wouldn't take kindly to seeing their interests threatened by family squabbles. The warning was clear enough. Push too hard, and Silas would find himself isolated, possibly even in legal trouble of his own. The system that was supposed to protect the innocent had been perverted to protect the profitable instead. Outside the sheriff's office, Main Street bustled with its usual activity. Mrs. Henderson swept the steps of the general store, while her husband arranged fresh produce in wooden crates. Young Billy Patterson delivered newspapers to the various businesses, whistling a tune that carried on the morning breeze. Normal life continuing in blissful ignorance of the violence hidden behind respectability's facade. Dr. Henderson caught sight of him from across the street and raised a hand in greeting. The old physician had delivered both Holt boys, had set Silas's broken arm when he was 12, and doctored their father through his final illness. If anyone in town might be willing to listen, to help, it would be Doc Henderson. Silas crossed the street, dodging a freight wagon loaded with lumber, destined for some new construction project funded, no doubt, by Holt prosperity. The irony wasn't lost on him. His family's success had bought them influence enough to commit crimes with impunity, while simultaneously making him complicit in a system that valued profit over justice. Morning, Silas, Doc Henderson said, his weathered face creasing into a genuine smile. Good to have you back in town. How were the northern pastures? Productive, Silas replied, then lowered his voice. Doc, I need to talk to you about something important. Something private. The older man's expression grew serious as he read the tension in Silas's manner. "Come on inside. We'll talk in my office." As they walked toward the doctor's modest practice, Silas felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since discovering Evelyn's condition. Maybe the law had been compromised. Maybe the sheriff had sold his conscience for economic stability. But Doc Henderson was a healer. Surely a man dedicated to mending what was broken would understand the need to stop the breaking in the first place. The blood-stained handkerchief felt lighter in his pocket as he followed the doctor inside, carrying with it the possibility that someone in Cedar Ridge still believed in doing what was right, regardless of the cost. Doc Henderson's office smelled of carbolic acid and aged leather, familiar scents that had comforted Silas through childhood illnesses and injuries. The old physician closed the door behind them and gestured toward the worn wooden chair beside his desk, the same chair where Silas had sat as a boy, while the doctor explained why his father wouldn't be coming home from his final illness. "Now then," Henderson said, settling behind his desk, with the careful movements of a man whose joints remembered every winter. "What's troubling you, son?" Silas pulled out the blood-stained handkerchief, placing it on the desk between them. "Evelyn's in trouble, Doc. Bad trouble." Henderson's practiced eyes took in the stained cloth, his expression growing grave. He'd seen enough blood in his 40 years of practice to recognize the signs of violence when presented with them. "How bad?" "Bad enough that she's learning to flinch before anyone raises their voice. Bad enough that she's got bruises she tries to hide with powder and long sleeves." Silas's voice grew rough with suppressed anger. "My brother's beating her, Doc. Regular-like, from what I can tell." The doctor was quiet for a long moment, studying the handkerchief with the careful attention he'd give to examining a patient. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of reluctant knowledge. "I've suspected as much for a while now." Henderson opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small leather journal, flipping through pages filled with his careful handwriting. "She's been in to see me 3 times in the past 6 months, always with explanations that don't quite fit the injuries." "You've seen her? Why didn't you say something? To whom?" Henderson's question carried its own bitter answer. "Sheriff Morrison. We both know where his loyalties lie. The preacher? Reverend Walsh thinks wives should submit to their husbands in all things, even if it kills them." He closed the journal with a snap. "Besides, she made me promise not to tell anyone. Said it would only make things worse for her." The doctor stood and moved to his medicine cabinet, pulling out a small brown bottle and setting it on the desk. "Laudanum. I've been giving her small amounts to help with the pain, but I hate doing it. Pain has a purpose. It tells us something's wrong. Taking it away without addressing the cause just enables the harm to continue." Silas stared at the bottle, imagining Evelyn measuring out careful drops to numb herself against her husband's fists. The thought made his stomach turn. "There's got to be something we can do. Some way to help her." "I've tried." Henderson returned to his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "I've offered to document her injuries, to provide medical testimony if she ever wanted to seek legal recourse. But she won't hear of it. Says she loves him, that he doesn't mean to hurt her, that it's her fault for provoking him. It's not love, Doc. It's fear dressed up to look like devotion. I know that, and you know that, but she's not ready to admit it yet." Henderson leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped on the desktop. "The mind has ways of protecting itself from truths too painful to accept. She's convinced herself that she can manage the situation, that she can somehow love him into being the man she thought she married." Silas thought about the wedding day, about Evelyn's radiant smile and genuine laughter. Had there been signs even then? Had Eli's possessiveness and need for control been visible to anyone paying attention? How long do you think this has been going on? Hard to say for certain. The first time she came to me was about 4 months after the wedding. Claimed she'd fallen down the stairs and twisted her wrist. But the bruising pattern was wrong. Looked more like someone had grabbed her and twisted hard. Henderson's voice took on the clinical tone he used when discussing difficult cases. The human body tells stories, Silas. Bruises have their own language, their own timeline. Evelyn's body has been telling the same story for months now. The doctor opened his journal again, scanning the entries. June 15th, bruised ribs. Claimed she'd fallen off a ladder while cleaning. August 3rd, split lip and blackened eye. Said she'd walked into a door in the dark. September 22nd, fingerprint bruises on her upper arms, explained as a horseback riding accident. Each entry hit Silas like a physical blow. While he'd been managing cattle in the northern pastures, content in his ignorance, Evelyn had been living a nightmare of escalating violence. The guilt settled over him like a heavy coat, warming nothing and weighing everything down. Why didn't you write to me? Send word that something was wrong? Because she begged me not to. Henderson closed the journal again. Said if anyone in the family found out, Eli would know she'd been talking. She was terrified of what he'd do if he thought she was betraying family secrets. The phrase, family secrets, stuck in Silas's throat like a fishbone. That's what they'd become, participants in a conspiracy of silence that protected the abuser while abandoning his victim. Every person who knew the truth and said nothing became complicit in Evelyn's suffering. There's something else, Henderson said quietly. Something I haven't told anyone, not even in my journal. Silas waited, dreading what new horror was about to be revealed. Last month, she asked me about pregnancy, whether there were ways to prevent it, or— the doctor's voice faltered, or to end it if it had already begun. The implications hit Silas like a stampeding bull. Evelyn wasn't just being beaten. She was being forced to endure the ultimate intimacy with the man who terrorized her. The thought of bringing a child into that house of violence had driven her to seek options that went against everything her upbringing had taught her. Did you— I gave her information about preventing pregnancy, natural methods, herbs that might help. Henderson's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. I drew the line at anything else. I'm a healer, not a— He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Silas understood. Doc Henderson had walked as far down that dark path as his conscience would allow, but he couldn't cross the final line. Even to save Evelyn from bringing a child into hell, he couldn't bring himself to end a life that might already have begun. She's trapped, isn't she? Silas said finally. Legally, socially, morally, every door is locked. Every conventional door, Henderson agreed. But sometimes, when conventional medicine fails, we have to consider unconventional remedies. The two men sat in silence, each contemplating the implications of that statement. Outside, Cedar Ridge continued its peaceful existence, unaware that in a doctor's office on Main Street, two men were beginning to plan something that would shatter that peace forever. The blood-stained handkerchief lay between them, like evidence in a trial that would never take place, a reminder that sometimes justice required more than law, more than medicine, more than prayer. Sometimes justice required ordinary men to become something else, entirely, something dangerous. Eli's voice carried through the house like honey poured over broken glass, sweet and smooth until it cut deep enough to draw blood. Silas found his brother in their father's old study, reading from the leather-bound Bible that had occupied the center of Reverend Holt's desk for 27 years of Sunday sermons and weekday counseling. "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord," Eli read aloud, his finger tracing the familiar verse. "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church." He looked up as Silas entered, his smile carrying the satisfied certainty of a man who'd found divine justification for his earthly appetites. The sight of that particular Bible in Eli's hands made Silas's stomach clench. Their father had preached from those pages for decades, but never with the twisted interpretation that his younger son now embraced. Reverend Jacob Holt had spoken of love and protection, of husbands cherishing their wives as Christ loved the church, willing to die for them, not to destroy them. "Afternoon, Eli." Silas kept his voice neutral, though every instinct screamed at him to snatch the sacred book from his brother's defiling touch. "Catching up on your scripture?" Always important to refresh one's understanding of God's design for marriage. Eli closed the Bible, but kept his hand resting on its worn cover, especially when outsiders start questioning what goes on in a man's own household. The warning was subtle, but unmistakable. Word had already reached Eli about Silas's conversation with Sheriff Morrison. In a town the size of Cedar Ridge, secrets had the lifespan of morning dew, and apparently Morrison's loyalty to the Holt family extended to keeping Eli informed of any potential trouble. "Can't say I know what you mean by that," Silas replied, settling into the chair across from his father's desk, the same chair where he'd sat as a boy, listening to stories about moral courage and standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves. "Of course not." Eli's laugh was warm and brotherly, the sound he'd perfected over years of charming his way out of consequences. "Just making conversation, though I do hear you've been asking questions around town. About me, about my wife." The possessive emphasis on "my wife" carried its own threat. Evelyn wasn't a person in Eli's mind. She was property, an investment to be protected from outside interference. The realization settled over Silas like a cold fog, chilling him to the bone. Evelyn's family now. Family looks out for each other. Family also respects boundaries. Eli opened the Bible again, flipping through pages with the casual familiarity of someone who'd spent considerable time finding verses that supported his worldview. "Here's another good one. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man." Silas watched his brother's fingers caress the holy text and felt something dark and violent stir in his chest. This wasn't faith. It was blasphemy dressed in scripture, evil wearing the mask of righteousness. Their father would have wept to see his beloved Bible used to justify cruelty. "Funny how you always manage to find the verses that give you what you want," Silas said quietly. "Never seem to remember the ones about loving your wife as your own body, or treating her with honor and respect." Eli's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Love takes many forms, brother. Sometimes it requires discipline. Sometimes it requires correction." He leaned forward, his voice taking on the persuasive cadence he'd learned watching their father preach. "A good husband guides his wife, shapes her into the woman God intended her to be. It's not always pleasant, but it's necessary. And I suppose the bruises are part of God's plan, too." "Careful, Silas." The friendly mask slipped just enough to reveal the predator underneath. "You're starting to sound like you're questioning the divine order of things. That's dangerous territory for a man who depends on family prosperity for his livelihood." There it was, the economic threat wrapped in theological language. Eli controlled the ranch's finances now, had gradually taken over that responsibility during Silas's frequent trips to the northern properties. One word from the younger brother, and Silas could find himself cut off from everything he'd helped build. "Maybe prosperity isn't worth as much as I thought," Silas said, rising from his chair. "Maybe some things matter more than money." "Nothing matters more than family unity," Eli countered, standing as well. "And family unity requires everyone to know their place, to accept their role in God's plan." He moved around the desk, coming closer with the predatory grace of a stalking cat. "Your role is managing cattle and staying out of matters that don't concern you. My role is being the head of this household and everything in it." The two brothers faced each other across the small study, the air thick with unspoken threats and barely contained violence. Silas could see the man his brother had become, or perhaps had always been, beneath the veneer of charm and respectability. This wasn't the mischievous boy he'd helped raise after their father died. This was something else entirely, something that had learned to use faith and family as weapons. "Where is she now?" Silas asked. "Resting. Yesterday was difficult for her." Eli's smile returned, but it carried no warmth. "She had another one of her clumsy spells, walked right into a door frame, split her lip something fierce, but she's learning to be more careful." The casual cruelty in those words hit Silas like a physical blow. Eli wasn't just beating his wife, he was taking pleasure in it, enjoying the power that came from breaking another human being's spirit. The religious justification was just window dressing on something much darker and more primitive. "You're making her afraid to live in her own home. I'm teaching her to respect her husband as God commands." Eli returned to the desk, picking up the Bible again. "She's actually quite grateful for the guidance once she understands its necessity. Women need firm direction, brother. Left to their own devices, they become willful and rebellious." Silas stared at the man he'd once loved like a son, searching for any trace of the brother he remembered. But that boy was gone, if he'd ever really existed. In his place stood someone who'd learned to twist love into control, faith into justification for cruelty, family into a shield for unspeakable behavior. The study fell silent, except for the ticking of their father's old clock on the mantelpiece. The same clock that had marked time through countless family discussions, marking the rhythm of a household built on genuine love and mutual respect. Now it seemed to be counting down to something inevitable and terrible. "I think we understand each other," Eli said finally, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd won an important victory. "Family harmony is precious, Silas. It would be a shame to see it disrupted by misunderstandings." Silas nodded slowly, letting his brother believe he'd accepted defeat. But inside, something had crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. The boy he'd helped raise was truly dead, replaced by a monster who used God's word to justify ungodly acts. And monsters, Silas had learned from years of ranching, sometimes had to be put down before they could hurt anyone else. The old rose garden behind the house held secrets as deep as its roots. Silas knelt among the thorny bushes his mother had planted 30 years ago, his fingers working the familiar weight of her gardening spade through soil that had been turned many times before. The tool felt solid in his hands, worn smooth by years of patient cultivation and the kind of honest work that built character rather than destroying it. But today, he wasn't planting. He was uncovering something that should have stayed buried. The metal blade struck something hard about 2 feet down, just where the roses grew thickest and most protective. Silas brushed away loose earth with careful fingers, revealing the corner of a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. His heart hammered as he worked to free it from its hiding place, though he already suspected what he'd find inside. The box was smaller than a coffin, but large enough to hold a woman's secrets. Inside, wrapped in fading silk, were letters, dozens of them, tied with ribbon that had once been white but had yellowed with age and fear. Silas untied the first bundle with trembling fingers, recognizing the delicate handwriting immediately. Sarah's letters. Sarah Wellston, the baker's daughter, who'd caught Eli's eye 3 summers ago, before he'd set his sights on Evelyn. The first letter was dated 2 years before Eli's wedding, written in the hopeful tone of a young woman newly in love. Sarah wrote about walks by the river, about plans for a future together, about the gentle courtship that had swept her off her feet. But as Silas read deeper into the correspondence, the tone began to change. My dearest Eli, one letter began, I must ask you again to please be more gentle with me. I know you say it's because you love me so much, but the bruises are becoming difficult to hide from Papa. Another, written weeks later. I tried to break our engagement today as you suggested, but I couldn't find the words. How can I tell Papa that I'm not worthy of marriage when he's so proud of the match? Perhaps if you could just control your temper when you're disappointed with me. The final letter in the bundle was different, written in a shaking hand that spoke of desperation and fear. I'm leaving Cedar Ridge tonight. I can't marry you, Eli. I can't live the rest of my life afraid of my own husband's hands. Please don't try to find me. I'll never tell anyone what happened between us, but I can't stay silent and watch you do to someone else what you did to me. Sarah had disappeared one autumn night, supposedly to care for a sick relative back east. The story had been accepted without question. Young women often left small towns for better opportunities in the larger world. But now, reading her final letter, Silas understood the truth. Sarah hadn't left for opportunity. She'd fled for her life. And 6 months later, Eli had begun courting Evelyn. The pattern was becoming clear, as neat and predictable as the rows in his mother's vegetable garden. Eli chose vulnerable women, isolated them from their support systems, then gradually revealed his true nature once they were trapped by engagement or marriage. Sarah had been lucky. She'd recognized the danger before. Legal bonds made escape nearly impossible. Evelyn hadn't been so fortunate. Silas continued reading, finding other correspondence mixed in with Sarah's letters. There were threatening notes from townspeople who'd been pressured to keep quiet about various incidents. A letter from the bank president to Eli, praising his business acumen while subtly warning about maintaining community standards. Most damning of all, a response from Sheriff Morrison to some inquiry, stating that local family matters should be handled locally without outside interference from territorial authorities. The corruption ran deeper than Silas had imagined. Eli hadn't just bought silence with prosperity, he'd created an entire network of complicity. Everyone from the banker to the sheriff had reasons to look the other way, to protect the fiction that Cedar Ridge was a peaceful, God-fearing community, where such ugly things simply didn't happen. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of torn petticoat, Silas found the most disturbing evidence yet. A small silver locket that he recognized immediately. It had belonged to Mary Catherine Ross, a widow who'd briefly kept house for Eli during his bachelor days. She'd left town suddenly one winter, claiming her health required a warmer climate. The locket was dented, its chain broken. Inside was a miniature photograph of Mary Catherine's deceased husband, but the glass had been cracked as if it had been stepped on or deliberately damaged. Dark stains on the silver suggested it had been worn during violence, perhaps torn from her neck during a struggle. Mary Catherine Ross, Sarah Wellston, and now Evelyn Marks Holt. 3 women, each drawn to Eli's charm, each discovering too late the monster that charm concealed. Sarah had escaped, Mary Catherine had fled, but Evelyn was trapped by marriage vows and social expectations that made leaving impossible. Silas sat back on his heels, surrounded by the evidence of his brother's systematic cruelty. The rose garden seemed to mock him with its beauty, its thorns a reminder that even the loveliest things could draw blood if handled carelessly. But this wasn't carelessness. This was deliberate, calculated evil dressed up in respectability's clothes. The garden spade felt heavier in his hands now, weighted with the knowledge of what it had helped him uncover. This tool had planted life, had nurtured growth, had built something beautiful from humble soil, but it could serve other purposes too, if necessary. From the house came the sound of voices, Eli's smooth baritone and Evelyn's careful responses. She was agreeing with everything he said, her tone carrying the practiced submission of someone who'd learned that disagreement brought punishment. Sarah and Mary Catherine had once spoken to him in those same measured tones, had once tried to appease the unappeasable. Silas carefully returned the letters to their hiding place, but kept the broken locket. Physical evidence might be needed later, when words weren't enough to convince those who profited from willful blindness. The garden would keep the rest safe until the time came for broader revelations. As he stood and brushed soil from his knees, Silas felt the weight of his father's watch against his ribs. The old man's voice seemed to whisper across the years. Sometimes the hardest choice is the right choice, son. That's how you know it's worth making. The choice was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence, each revelation of systematic abuse. The legal system had been compromised, the community bought and paid for, and his own family name used as a shield for monstrous behavior. But some things were more important than law, more sacred than prosperity, more vital than keeping the peace. Some truths demanded action, regardless of consequences. The rose garden held its secrets well, but it wouldn't hold them forever. Like everything planted in good soil, they would eventually come to light, bringing either beautiful growth or necessary reckoning. Silas suspected it would be the latter. The bundle of letters hidden beneath Eli's mattress told a different story than the one Silas had expected to find. His hands shook as he read the careful script, written in his brother's practiced penmanship, but revealing a mind far more calculating and dangerous than he'd imagined possible. The first letter was addressed to a man named Vincent Cray in Billings, dated just 3 weeks ago. Silas had never heard the name, but the content made his blood run cold. "My dear Vincent," it began, "I believe the time has come to implement our contingency plan. My brother's interference has become more persistent, and my wife's loyalty is proving less reliable than anticipated. As we discussed, both problems can be resolved simultaneously, leaving me free to relocate with a clear conscience and substantial resources." Silas's vision blurred as he processed the implications. This wasn't just about abuse, it was about murder. Cold, premeditated murder, designed to eliminate both witnesses and obstacles to some larger scheme. He forced himself to keep reading, each word adding another layer to the horrifying truth. The letters revealed a correspondence spanning months, detailing a plan so methodical and heartless it defied belief. Vincent Cray, it seemed, was a professional killer, and Eli had been paying him to arrange what would look like tragic accidents. "The ranch property alone is worth $40,000, one letter explained. "But the mineral rights we discovered last spring could be worth 10 times that amount. With both Silas and Evelyn gone, I inherit everything as the sole surviving family member. The copper deposits you helped me identify will make us both wealthy men. Copper deposits. Silas felt his legs give way, forcing him to sit heavily on the edge of Eli's bed. That's what this was really about. Not just the sadistic pleasure of controlling and hurting women, but a larger scheme to steal the family ranch and its newly discovered mineral wealth. During his months in the northern pastures, Silas had noticed unusual rock formations, reddish streaks in the hillsides that might indicate copper veins. He'd mentioned it casually to Eli, thinking it might be worth having a geologist examine the area. Apparently, his brother had done exactly that, in secret, and discovered a fortune buried beneath Holt land. But the mineral rights were complex. Their father's will had left the ranch to both sons equally, with specific provisions about unanimous consent for major decisions like mining operations. As long as Silas lived, Eli couldn't exploit the discovery without sharing the profits. And as long as Evelyn lived, she posed a threat as someone who might reveal the truth about her husband's nature. The solution, as laid out in meticulous detail through months of correspondence, was to eliminate both problems permanently. Silas found a letter dated just 5 days ago, written in Eli's hand, but unsigned. Timing is crucial now. My brother returned from the north earlier than expected, and his suspicions are growing daily. He's been asking questions around town, talking to the doctor, even approaching the sheriff. We cannot allow this investigation to continue. The accident must happen soon. Make it look like a confrontation between brothers over the woman, a crime of passion that ended tragically for all involved. The story should be that Silas discovered my wife's infidelity, attacked us both in a jealous rage, and I was forced to defend myself. Unfortunately, all 3 parties died in the struggle. I'll be the grieving survivor, the only witness to a terrible family tragedy. With proper staging, no one will question the official version of events. The calculated cruelty took Silas's breath away. Eli planned to murder both his brother and his wife, then frame it as a love triangle gone wrong. The community would sympathize with the surviving brother, the innocent victim of family violence. And with Silas and Evelyn dead, Eli would inherit everything and be free to exploit the mineral rights without interference. More letters revealed additional details of the conspiracy. Vincent Cray was already in Cedar Ridge, posing as a traveling merchant while he studied the town's routines and identified the best opportunities for staging the murders. He'd been watching Silas's movements, learning his habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The plan was scheduled to unfold tomorrow night, when most of the town would be at the monthly church social. Cray would break into the house, kill Evelyn first to ensure her silence, then wait for Silas to return from what Eli would claim was a secret rendezvous with his sister-in-law. When Silas arrived, he'd find his brother defending his wife from the intruder, leading to a deadly confrontation that would leave all 3 dead. Eli's final letter to Cray was the most chilling of all. Remember, the woman must suffer before she dies. It should look like she was assaulted during the robbery, adding credibility to our story. My brother must be shot with his own gun after the struggle, and I must have defensive wounds that show I fought valiantly to protect my family. The staging must be perfect. Any inconsistency could raise questions we cannot afford to answer. After tomorrow night, we'll both be free to pursue our fortunes elsewhere. The mineral rights alone will support us for years, and with the ranch sold, we'll have enough capital to establish ourselves in California or Colorado. Your fee remains as agreed, $20,000 plus a share of the mining profits. It's a steep price, but the alternative is unacceptable. My current situation has become untenable. Silas's hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold the papers. The scope of his brother's betrayal was beyond anything he'd imagined possible. This wasn't just domestic violence escalating to murder. This was a calculated business decision, a cold-blooded scheme to eliminate inconvenient family members for financial gain. Footsteps on the stairs sent him scrambling to return the letters to their hiding place. He managed to replace them just as Eli's voice carried down the hallway, speaking to someone Silas couldn't see. "Yes, everything's arranged for tomorrow evening," Eli was saying. "My brother should return around 9 o'clock, just as we discussed." Silas slipped out of the bedroom and down the back stairs, his heart pounding like a runaway horse. He had to find Evelyn, had to warn her about what was coming. But even as he formed the plan, he realized the terrible truth. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, that Eli and his hired killer couldn't find them. The conspiracy reached too deep, involved too many people, had too much money behind it to be stopped by conventional means. Sheriff Morrison was compromised, the bank president was involved, and half the town depended on Holt prosperity for their livelihoods. No one would believe Silas's accusations against the charming, successful younger brother who brought jobs and money to Cedar Ridge. Worse, any attempt to expose the plot would only accelerate the timeline. If Eli suspected that Silas had discovered the letters, the murders would happen tonight instead of tomorrow, before any warning could be given or escape arranged. As Silas made his way toward the kitchen where Evelyn was preparing dinner, his father's watch felt like a lead weight against his chest. The old man's words echoed in his memory. "Do what's right, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you." But what was right in a situation where law and justice had been perverted to serve evil? What was right when the choice was between murdering a murderer or allowing him to kill innocent people? The kitchen door stood open before him, warm light spilling out onto the porch steps. Inside, Evelyn moved through her evening routine, unaware that she had less than 24 hours to live unless something drastic changed. Silas touched the secret letters in his pocket, feeling their weight like stones that could either build a foundation or be used as weapons. Tomorrow night, Vincent Cray would come to kill them both, confident that his carefully laid plan would succeed. But now Silas knew about the plan, and that knowledge, terrible as it was, might be the only weapon powerful enough to turn the tables on the men who thought they'd already won. The game was about to change, whether Eli realized it or not. The weight of his grandfather's Colt revolver pressed against Silas's hip as he sat in the barn, cleaning and loading the weapon by lamplight. The gun had belonged to his mother's father, carried through 3 Indian wars and the early days of territorial law, when justice came from the barrel of a gun more often than from courthouse deliberations. He'd retrieved it from the hidden compartment behind his father's desk, along with a box of ammunition that had waited 30 years for this moment. The Colt was old but well maintained, its steel still true, and its action smooth. It had been made for killing, and tonight it would serve that purpose again. 20 feet away, Doc Henderson stood watch at the barn door, his medical bag beside him, and his own pistol, a small but deadly derringer, tucked into his coat pocket. The old doctor's hands were steady despite his age, steady enough to patch wounds or create them if necessary. "You're certain about the plan?" Henderson asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the night sounds of the ranch. "As certain as I can be." Silas checked the cylinder one final time, counting 6 rounds that might be the difference between justice and catastrophe. "Evelyn's safe in the root cellar. She'll stay hidden until this is over." Getting Evelyn to safety had been the hardest part of the evening's preparations. She'd resisted at first, clinging to the desperate hope that somehow the situation could be resolved peacefully. But when Silas showed her the letters, when she read Eli's cold calculations about her death, the last of her illusions had crumbled like autumn leaves. "He really means to kill us both," she'd whispered, her voice hollow with the shock of absolute betrayal. "I knew he was cruel, but this is something else, entirely." The root cellar beneath the kitchen had been dug during the early years of the ranch, when Indian raids were still a real threat. It was deep, well concealed, and stocked with enough supplies to last several days if necessary. More importantly, it had a tunnel that led to the creek bank 50 yards from the house, an escape route that their grandfather had built but never needed to use. If things went wrong tonight, Evelyn had instructions to wait until dawn, then follow the tunnel to the creek and make her way to the neighboring Patterson ranch. Tom Patterson was a good man who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about a woman fleeing in the night, especially if she carried the letters that proved Eli's guilt. But if things went right, she wouldn't need the escape route. By morning, the threat would be ended, and Cedar Ridge would have to confront some uncomfortable truths about the man they'd allowed to prosper in their midst. "I still don't like this," Henderson said, checking his pocket watch against the barn lantern's light. "Too many variables. Too many ways for it to go wrong." "You have a better idea?" Silas holstered the Colt and began checking his other preparations. "Run to Sheriff Morrison. He's already proven where his loyalties lie. Appeal to the territorial marshal? He's 2 days' ride away, and we don't have 2 days." The plan they'd settled on was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Vincent Cray would arrive expecting to find Evelyn alone and vulnerable, with Silas away from the ranch. Instead, he'd walk into a trap where the hunters had become the hunted. Silas had spent the afternoon studying the man who'd come to kill him. Cray was staying at Murphy's boarding house, posing as a traveling salesman specializing in farm equipment. He was a large man, powerfully built, with the kind of cold eyes that suggested he'd killed before and felt no particular remorse about it. But size and ruthlessness weren't everything in a fight. Cray expected easy victims, an unsuspecting woman and an unprepared rancher. He wouldn't be ready for organized resistance, for men who knew he was coming and had prepared accordingly. The church social had provided perfect cover for their preparations. Half the town was gathered in the meeting hall, singing hymns and sharing fellowship, while completely unaware of the life and death struggle being planned in their midst. Eli was there too, playing the role of the devoted husband who'd left his wife at home with a convenient headache. "What if Cray doesn't come alone?" Henderson asked. "What if Eli decides to be here for the finale? Then we adjust." Silas blew out the barn lantern, letting his eyes adapt to the moonlight that filtered through the high windows. But the letters suggest Cray works alone, and Eli's too smart to put himself at the scene. He needs to be at the church social, establishing his alibi for when bodies start turning up. They moved through the barn in practiced silence, taking positions they'd rehearsed earlier. Henderson stationed himself in the hayloft, where he'd have a clear view of the house and the surrounding yard. His role was to watch for additional threats and provide covering fire if needed. Silas took position in the machine shed, 20 yards from the kitchen door that Cray would almost certainly use for his entry. The shed's windows had been carefully prepared, glass removed to prevent reflective glare, sight lines cleared for accurate shooting. The Colt felt familiar in his hands, despite the years since he'd last fired it in anger. Some skills were burned too deep to fade: how to breathe during a gunfight, how to aim in poor light, how to kill a man when killing was the only option left. His father's watch read 8:30 when they settled into their positions. Cray would come at 9, according to the schedule detailed in Eli's letters. 30 minutes to wait. 30 minutes to contemplate what they were about to do, and whether any power on earth could justify it. The moral weight of premeditated killing pressed down on Silas like a physical burden. His father had taught him that every life was precious, that violence should always be the last resort of desperate men. But what happened when desperate times called for desperate measures? What happened when the law failed and innocent people faced death at the hands of those the law was supposed to control? Your father would understand. Henderson's voice drifted down from the loft, as if the old doctor could read his thoughts. Jacob Holt believed in protecting the innocent above all. Else, he'd have done the same thing in your position? Maybe. Or maybe his father would have found another way, some path that preserved both justice and mercy. But his father had never faced anything like this, a conspiracy that reached into every corner of the community, a killer for hire, backed by corrupted officials and blood money. The night air carried sounds from the distant church social, laughter and conversation, the voices of people enjoying fellowship and community, while completely unaware of the darkness that had settled over their peaceful town. Tomorrow, they'd wake to discover that their prosperity had been built on blood, their peace purchased with the silence of victims. But tonight, those victims would finally have their voice. 8:45. Somewhere in the distance, a horse was moving at a steady pace toward the ranch. Not the hurried gallop of someone with legitimate business, but the measured approach of a man who had all the time in the world to complete his deadly task. Silas drew the Colt and checked the cylinder one final time, feeling the weight of 6 bullets that might end 3 lives before the night was over. His own, if things went badly. Cray's, if justice prevailed. And Eli's eventually, because tonight's work wouldn't be finished until both conspirators paid for their crimes. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by the jingle of harness and the creak of leather. A single rider, just as the letters had promised. Vincent Cray, professional killer, coming to collect his fee by murdering an innocent woman and her brother-in-law. But innocent people had died in Cedar Ridge for the last time. Tonight, the predator would discover that his chosen prey had teeth of their own, and the wisdom to use them when cornerness gave no other choice. The grandfather's Colt felt warm in Silas's hands, as if the old weapon remembered what it had been made for and welcomed the chance to serve justice one final time. Outside, the hoofbeats stopped near the house, followed by the soft sounds of a man dismounting and securing his horse. Vincent Cray had arrived to commit murder. Instead, he was about to discover that some sins carried their own punishment, and that frontier justice had never really died. It had just been waiting for the right moment to return. That moment had come. Vincent Cray moved through the darkness like a predator who'd spent years perfecting the art of silent killing. Silas watched from the machine shed as the man approached the kitchen door, noting the professional way he tested each step before committing his weight, the careful manner in which he examined the house for signs of unexpected occupants. But Cray's expertise worked against him tonight. His caution made him predictable, his methodical approach giving Silas time to track his movement and anticipate his next actions. The killer paused at the kitchen window, peering through the glass at the empty room beyond, then moved to the door with the confidence of a man who believed himself unopposed. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the yard as Cray forced the lock, the violence sudden and sharp in the quiet night. Silas felt his finger tighten on the Colt's trigger, but forced himself to wait. Let the killer enter the house. Let him discover that his intended victims weren't where they were supposed to be. Confusion would be a weapon in itself. Lamplight flickered through the kitchen windows as Cray moved deeper into the house, his heavy boots creaking on the wooden floors. Silas could imagine him checking each room, growing more puzzled and perhaps more cautious with each empty space. Where was the defenseless woman he'd been hired to assault and murder? Where was the unsuspecting brother-in-law who should have walked into a death trap? A crash from inside the house suggested that Cray's frustration was beginning to overcome his professionalism. Something heavy hit the floor, a chair overturned perhaps, or a table shoved aside in anger. The careful stalker was becoming a raging animal, and animals made mistakes that professionals avoided. The kitchen door slammed open with enough force to rattle the frame, and Cray emerged onto the porch like fury given human form. He was even larger than he'd appeared from a distance, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of physical labor and hands that looked capable of breaking bones without tools. "Where are you?" he bellowed into the night, abandoning stealth for intimidation. "I know you're out there somewhere. Might as well come out and make this easy on everyone." Silas remained motionless in the machine shed, letting Cray's rage build while studying the man's movements. The killer carried a long-barreled revolver in his right hand and something that glinted like a knife in his left. Professional tools for professional work, but tools were only as effective as the man who wielded them. "Your brother's paying me good money to kill you both," Cray continued, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man who viewed murder as just another day's work. "But I'm starting to think he didn't give me all the facts about this job." The admission confirmed what Silas had suspected. Eli had lied to his hired killer, just as he'd lied to everyone else. Cray had expected easy victims, not prepared opponents who'd turned his own ambush tactics against him. Movement in the barn caught Silas's attention. Doc Henderson was shifting position in the hayloft, probably trying to get a clearer shot at the increasingly agitated killer. But the angle was wrong from there. Too many obstacles between the loft and Cray's position on the porch. "I'll make you a deal," Cray called out, his tone becoming mockingly reasonable. "Come out now. Bring the woman with you, and I'll make it quick. Keep hiding, and I'll spend all night tracking you down. Trust me, you don't want me to do that." Silas could hear the truth in those words. Men like Cray didn't give up, didn't accept failure, didn't walk away from contracts even when the circumstances changed. If anything, the challenge would only make him more determined to complete his deadly mission. But he was also getting careless, standing exposed in the lamplight streaming from the kitchen, presenting himself as a clear target for anyone with the skill and nerve to take the shot. Silas rose slowly from his concealment, the Colt steady in his grip despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The machine shed's window frame provided a natural rest for his shooting arm, and the distance was well within the old revolver's effective range. "Vincent Cray!" he called out, his voice carrying across the yard with quiet authority. "You're trespassing on private property with intent to commit murder. I suggest you mount up and ride out while you still can." Cray spun toward the voice, his own weapon coming up with the fluid motion of long practice. But he was silhouetted against the kitchen light while Silas remained hidden in shadow, a tactical disadvantage that no amount of professional skill could overcome. "There you are," Cray snarled, his gun swinging toward the machine shed. "Thought you were clever, did you? Thought you could outsmart a professional?" "I thought I could give you one chance to leave," Silas replied, steadying his aim on the center of Cray's chest. "Guess I was wrong about that too." The professional killer's gun barrel found its target just as Silas squeezed the trigger of his grandfather's Colt. 2 muzzle flashes lit the night simultaneously. 2 bullets crossed the darkness between predator and prey, and the sound of gunfire shattered the peaceful silence of Cedar Ridge forever. When the echoes faded, only one man was left standing. Vincent Cray lay motionless on the kitchen porch, his professional career ended by a bullet from a weapon older than he was. The shot had taken him center mass, just as Silas had intended, dropping the killer instantly and ensuring he'd never threaten another innocent person. But the gunfire had also announced to all of Cedar Ridge that something violent had occurred at the Holt Ranch. Within minutes, riders would be heading toward the sound, including Sheriff Morrison and quite possibly Eli himself, abandoning his carefully constructed alibi to investigate the disruption of his murder plot. "Clean shooting," Doc Henderson called from the barn as he climbed down from the hayloft. "Your grandfather would be proud." Silas holstered the Colt and moved quickly toward the house, his mind already working through what had to happen next. Cray's death solved the immediate threat, but Eli remained free and dangerous. Worse, with his hired killer dead, the younger brother might resort to more desperate measures to eliminate the witnesses to his schemes. "Help me drag him into the kitchen," Silas said, as Henderson joined him beside Cray's body. "We need to stage this properly before anyone arrives." They worked quickly to arrange the scene, positioning Cray's body to suggest he'd been shot while breaking into the house, rather than during a planned ambush. The splintered door frame supported the story of forced entry, and the killer's weapons, found on his person, along with a substantial roll of cash, would raise uncomfortable questions about his true purpose in Cedar Ridge. "What about the letters?" Henderson asked as they completed their grim work. "Eli's correspondence with this man." Silas patted his coat pocket, where the incriminating documents waited like coiled snakes. "Evidence for later. Right now, we need to get Evelyn and prepare for whatever Eli tries next." The root cellar was dark and quiet when Silas lifted the concealed trapdoor, but he could hear movement below as Evelyn responded to his whispered call. She emerged like a ghost rising from the earth, her face pale, but her eyes holding a strength that hadn't been there before the night's revelations. "Is it over?" she asked, noting the blood on Silas's shirt and the grim satisfaction in his expression. "Part of it." He helped her climb out of the cellar, steadying her as she found her footing in the kitchen where violent death had so recently occurred. "Cray won't hurt anyone ever again. But Eli—" The sound of approaching horses cut through his words, multiple riders coming fast toward the ranch. Too many for a casual investigation, too organized for a spontaneous response to gunfire. Someone had been prepared for this moment, had anticipated the need for rapid action. Through the kitchen window, Silas counted at least 6 riders in the moonlight, their horses lathered from hard riding. Sheriff Morrison led the group, but behind him rode men Silas didn't recognize, hard-faced strangers who carried themselves like professional gunmen. "He brought backup," Henderson observed grimly. "Eli's not taking any chances." The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. His brother had planned for the possibility that Cray might fail, had arranged for additional killers to finish the job if necessary. The conspiracy was larger than anyone had imagined, reaching beyond Cedar Ridge to involve men who killed for money rather than personal grudges. "The deed," Evelyn said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The ranch deed, where is it?" Silas stared at her, not understanding the urgency in her tone. But she was already moving toward his father's desk, pulling open drawers with desperate efficiency. "If we're all dead, Eli inherits everything automatically," she explained, her hands shaking as she searched through papers. "But if the deed is destroyed, if there's no clear title to the property, the mineral rights become worthless. He can't sell what he can't prove he owns." The legal logic was sound, but it would also destroy everything their father had built, everything Silas had worked to preserve and expand. Burning the deed would deny Eli his prize, but it would also eliminate any hope of legitimate justice through the courts. "Do it," Silas said without hesitation, understanding that some sacrifices were worth making, burn it all. The deed, the mineral surveys, anything that proves ownership. Evelyn found what she was looking for and held up the thick parchment document that represented decades of honest labor and careful planning. The deed to the Holt Ranch, signed by territorial officials and witnessed by respected citizens, about to become fuel for a fire that would deny a killer his reward. The riders were dismounting in the yard, their voices carrying through the night air as they organized for what they clearly expected to be a systematic search and elimination of witnesses. But they were about to discover that their quarry had teeth of their own, and the wisdom to use them when cornered with no other choice. "Light the fire," Silas said, drawing the Colt again as boots thundered toward the kitchen door. "Whatever happens next, at least he won't profit from it." The flames caught quickly, hungry tongues of fire consuming the legal foundation of Eli's murderous scheme. Outside, violent men prepared for violence of their own, confident that superior numbers would overcome whatever resistance they encountered. They were about to learn that some fights were worth dying for, and some people refused to die quietly. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Evelyn Marks stood on the courthouse steps in the same spot where her journey toward freedom had begun. But this time, there was no veil hiding her face, no bruises requiring concealment. The woman who emerged into the morning sunlight bore little resemblance to the broken creature who had once whispered secrets to blood-stained handkerchiefs. The silver brooch on her collar caught the light as she moved, its polished surface reflecting the strength that had always lived within her, waiting for the right moment to shine. Doc Henderson had given it to her on the morning after, when the smoke had cleared and the truth had finally been told in full. It had belonged to his late wife, he'd explained, a woman who'd also known what it meant to endure hardship with grace. "Justice takes many forms," he'd said, fastening the brooch to her dress with gentle fingers. "Sometimes it comes from courts and juries. Sometimes it comes from ordinary people doing extraordinary things." The official story, as recorded in Sheriff Morrison's final report, was simpler than the truth, but close enough to satisfy those who preferred their scandals neat and contained. Vincent Cray, a known criminal with warrants in 3 territories, had broken into the Holt Ranch with intent to rob and murder. Silas Holt, acting in defense of his family, had killed the intruder during the struggle that followed. Eli's body had been found the next morning, shot while supposedly attempting to flee the scene of his brother's heroic stand. The hired killers who'd ridden with Sheriff Morrison that night had scattered like leaves before the territorial marshal's investigation, disappearing into the kind of anonymity that professional criminals cultivated. Morrison himself had resigned in disgrace when the scope of his corruption became impossible to ignore. But those were just the public facts, the version of events that appeared in newspaper accounts and territorial records. The real story was more complex, written in blood and sacrifice, and the kind of moral choices that defined character when everything else had been stripped away. Silas had survived the gunfight that followed Cray's death, but barely. 3 bullets had found their mark before Doc Henderson's medical skills and Evelyn's stubborn refusal to let him die had pulled him back from the edge. He walked with a slight limp now, carried his left arm a bit stiffly, but his eyes held the peace that came to men who'd faced the worst of themselves and emerged intact on the other side. The mineral rights that had started it all remained worthless paper, the surveys and legal documents reduced to ash in a kitchen fireplace, while desperate men fought over the right to live free from fear. The copper deposits were still there, buried beneath Montana soil, waiting for someone with cleaner hands and clearer conscience to discover them again. "Ready?" Silas asked, emerging from the courthouse behind her. He carried the simple gold wedding ring she'd chosen from Henderson's small collection. Nothing fancy, nothing that spoke of wealth or status, just a plain band that promised companionship rather than ownership. Evelyn turned to face the man who'd risked everything to give her back her life. The proposal had come quietly, without drama or desperate declarations of passion. Just an honest question from an honest man. Would she consider building something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed? "I can't promise to love you the way a wife should," she'd told him during one of their careful conversations. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. There's too much healing still to do." "I'm not asking for love," he'd replied, with the patience that had become his defining characteristic. "I'm asking for partnership, someone to share the work of rebuilding, someone to help make sense of what comes next." It wasn't romance, but it was something better. Respect, mutual protection, the kind of alliance that grew stronger with time rather than weaker. They would work together to restore the ranch, to create something worthy of the sacrifice that had purchased it. Whether love followed would be up to time and circumstance to decide. The new preacher waited inside the courthouse, a young man fresh from seminary who spoke of compassion rather than submission, healing rather than judgment. Reverend Walsh had left Cedar Ridge rather suddenly, his departure coinciding with certain revelations about the support he'd provided to Eli's reign of terror. "The town's talking," Silas said, as they prepared to enter the building. "Some folks aren't happy about us marrying so soon after everything that happened." "Let them talk." Evelyn adjusted the silver brooch on her collar, feeling its weight like armor against the judgment of those who'd preferred their peace purchased with other people's suffering. "We know the truth, and that's enough." The truth was that broken people could heal if given time and safety. The truth was that sometimes the law failed, and ordinary citizens had to become their own justice. The truth was that love could grow from respect, just as surely as flowers could bloom from soil that had been watered with tears. As they walked through the courthouse doors, Evelyn thought about the blood-stained handkerchief hidden away in her hope chest, kept as a reminder of how far she'd traveled and how much strength could be found in the darkest places. It would stay there always, a testament to survival and the price of freedom. The ceremony was brief, witnessed by Doc Henderson and the few townspeople who'd found the courage to support them publicly. When it was over, when the rings had been exchanged and the vows spoken, they emerged into a world that looked the same, but felt entirely different. Cedar Ridge spread below them in the valley, the same collection of buildings and familiar faces. But the corruption had been exposed, the secrets brought to light, and the silence that had enabled evil finally broken. It would take time to rebuild trust, time to create new leadership, time to heal the wounds that went deeper than anyone had imagined. But time was something they finally had, earned through courage and sacrifice, and the simple refusal to accept that wrong could triumph over right indefinitely. Evelyn Holt, the name still felt strange, walked beside her new husband toward their waiting horse, ready to begin whatever came next. The silver brooch caught the afternoon light as they rode away, carrying with it the promise that some stories could have happy endings, even when they began in darkness, especially when they began in darkness.